Hello, my friend. Welcome to Dreamy Nights. I'm so glad you're here. Tonight, we'll drift together into a gentle story, one woven from willow leaves, moonlight, and still water. A story about quiet care, soft lanterns, and the steady rhythm of evening peace. So settle in, take a slow breath, and let the weight of the day slip away. When you're ready, our story begins.
Ouch, Ati.
Evening was descending upon the Willow Tree Sanctuary, that tranquil place where time seemed to hush its footsteps and walk more softly. The air carried a faint coolness that followed the sun's retreat, and the pond mirrored the deepening sky in hues of indigo and silver. Elias, the sanctuary's caretaker, moved with quiet intention along the curved wooden path that wound between low lanterns and the great willow tree at the water's edge. He paused beneath the willow's arching boughs. The branches swayed gently, their slender leaves whispering to one another, a conversation only the wind could translate. Elias listened for a while, as he always did, not to understand, but simply to be present. Nearby, a ceramic teapot rested on a smooth stone bench, its surface glinting faintly in the fading light. Steam rose in a thin ribbon carrying the fragrance of chamomile and honeygrass. The scent mingled with that of the damp earth and pond water, sweet grounding and perfectly still. Elias poured a small cup, the amber liquid catching the last glint of daylight before he set it beside him. He reached for a small lantern, lighting it with a match that hissed softly before blooming into a steady glow. One by one, he kindled each lantern along the walkway. The reflections of their flames trembled across the pond, overlapping like gold threads woven into silk. The sanctuary came alive, not with sound, but with softness. The delicate hum of crickets, the muted splash of a distant fish, the faint rustle of fabric as Elias adjusted his shawl. Overhead, the first stars began to appear, scattered and serene. He moved toward the main hall, a low structure built of pale cedar and paper walls that glowed with amber light from within. Its doors were open to the night, allowing the soft breeze to carry in the scent of jasmine vines that curled along the veranda posts. Inside, everything was orderly mats, rolled cushions, fluffed tea trays, waiting in quiet patience. Elias set his teacup down on a wooden table and brushed his hands over the grain, feeling its smoothness beneath his fingertips. The room held a gentle hush, as though listening with him. He liked that the way silence in the sanctuary wasn't empty, but filled with invisible kindness. Outside, a nightbird called, once low and distant. Elias looked up from his task and through the paper screen could see the outline of the willow's long branches still swaying. He thought of how many nights he'd stood there, watching the same slow movement, the same soft rhythm marking the passage of countless twilights. He remembered the first time he came to this place years ago, when the willow was smaller and the pond's edges less defined. The sanctuary had grown not through haste, but through quiet care, each addition made with thought and patience. He'd often mused that peace itself was a kind of garden one tended over time, leaf by leaf, light by light. The teapot had cooled a little now. Elias poured another cup and carried it to the veranda. He sat resting his back against one of the cedar posts, the warmth of the cup seeping into his palms. Before him, the pond was a mirror of night, its surface smooth, save for the occasional ripple when a soft breeze passed or a tiny insect touched down for a moment of reflection. A pair of fireflies drifted by their slow pulses, echoing the lantern's glow. Their light was gentle, never intrusive, appearing, vanishing, reappearing again, like small thoughts floating through the calm of the evening. Elias watched them for a while, his breath aligning with their rhythm.
True.
When he rose, he walked again beneath the willow. The earth was cool beneath his feet, cushioned with moss and fallen leaves. He knelt beside the pond, trailing his fingers just beneath the surface. The water was silken cool, endlessly patient. It rippled outward from his touch, carrying silver rings of moonlight that drifted toward the roots of the willow. In that reflection, he saw both the tree and himself, blurred slightly by motion, as though time itself had softened the edges of everything. He smiled faintly, not from joy or sadness, but from the quiet recognition of being part of something that continued gently no matter the hour. He stayed there for a long moment, listening to the soft clinking of bamboo chimes that hung nearby. Each note faded slowly, leaving behind a tender echo that dissolved into stillness. The sanctuary was fully night now, lanterns steady, the pond luminous, the willow swaying in slow conversation with the wind. Elias rose at last and began his final small ritual of the evening, sweeping the walkway of fallen leaves. The broom moved rhythmically, whispering against the wood. Each stroke seemed to erase not debris, but the remnants of the day traces of footsteps, bits of thought left behind. By the time he reached the final lantern, his mind felt as clear and open as the pond itself. He leaned the broom against the post and looked once more across the sanctuary. Everything was in its place. The night hummed softly as though singing to itself. The air smelled faintly of jasmine and rain-soaked moss. In that stillness, Elias exhaled slow, even complete.
Przyjdę.
The night deepened gently over the Willow Tree Sanctuary. Beyond the great willow, the pond reflected a perfect moon, round, quiet, luminous as pearl. A soft breeze moved through the reeds, carrying the faint sweetness of jasmine, the musk of wet earth, and the light woody scent of cedar planks that had cooled under starlight. Inside the caretaker's quarters, Elias set aside his folded shawl and unrolled a small bundle of tools: soft cloths, a fine brush, a tiny pot of oil infused with lotus root. It was his ritual each evening to tend to the sanctuary's lanterns, wiping the glass, straightening their wicks, giving them a delicate polish so the light would breathe evenly through the night. The room was simple tatami mats, a low table, a shelf of worn books. From one wall, a paper screen opened to the veranda, framing the pond like a living painting. The sound of water brushing gently against the shore filled the space between thoughts. Elias lit a small incense stick, placing it beside the window. The smoke curled upward in thin ribbons, carrying a fragrance like sweet hay and faint honey. He dipped the brush into the oil and moved it across the lantern's metal rim. The gesture was unhurried, circular, almost meditative. As he worked, he noticed how the flame's reflection shimmered over his hands, gold and soft, never still. Each lantern held a small world inside glass, fire, air reflection. He thought of them as guardians of the night's calm. When he finished, he carried the lanterns one by one outside, hanging them from curved hooks along the path that wound between the willow and the guest cottages. Each lantern's light spread gently over the stones, turning moss into soft emerald and sand into brushed silver.
Damo, Pki,
Elias paused midway down the path. The air had cooled and his breath clouded faintly. From nearby trees came the rhythmic chirping of crickets, steady and precise as a heartbeat. He listened to their pattern, the way it filled the spaces between the leaves' rustle, between the faraway hoot of a night owl and the faint lap of water. It was all music, woven without beginning or end. In the guest house, nearest the pond, he could see a faint shadow shift behind the screen, a traveler resting. The sanctuary often welcomed wanderers who came seeking quiet artists, herbalists, dreamers who stayed for a few nights to breathe differently. Elias rarely spoke much with them. Words he found could disturb the stillness they sought. Instead, he offered peace in smaller ways. A pot of tea waiting by dawn, a folded blanket left near the door, the steady presence of lamplight when they awoke at midnight. He touched the nearest lantern again, adjusting its wick slightly. Its flames steadied its reflection rippling along the surface of the pond. The willow's branches swayed above long fingers, brushing the water as though tracing invisible circles. Returning to the veranda, Elias poured fresh water into the kettle. He added dried blossoms, lavender this time, with a hint of lemon balm, and watched them spin slowly as they met the warmth. The scent rose at once, gentle but bright, filling the small room. As the tea steeped, he sat and listened to the faint bubbling, his palms resting lightly on his knees. He thought of how every sound in the sanctuary carried patience, the drip of condensation from the eaves, the sigh of reeds in the wind, the soft pulse of his own heartbeat. Nothing hurried, nothing demanded. It all simply was. He lifted the lid of the kettle slightly, letting steam curl up into the lamplight. Tiny droplets gathered on the metal rim, catching the glow before slipping down. Watching them fall, Elias reflected on how even water moved with purpose, always seeking stillness, always finding its level. The tea was ready. He poured a cup and carried it back outside. The air met him cool and damp, wrapping him gently. He could feel the temperature shift between the warm room and the night's breath, a contrast that made the tea's heat more precious in his hands. He walked along the path again, sipping slowly. The taste was soft and floral, with a note of sweetness that lingered at the back of his tongue. Each step on the wooden boards gave a faint rhythmic creak. Beneath the walkway, frogs sang somewhere unseen. As he moved past the willow, he noticed the pond's surface had gathered small flecks of pollen, golden dots gliding over black water. They floated lazily, drawn by the light of the nearest lantern, circling it, like tiny planets around a sun. Elias leaned against the railing, watching their slow orbit. After a time, he continued to the small dock that jutted into the pond. It was made of old cedar boards, polished smooth by years of rain and footsteps. He sat at the edge, lowering his bare feet into the cool water. The sensation was startling at first, then soothing, the pond receiving him without a ripple of protest. Across the water, the reflection of the willow reached toward him, its green silhouette deepened by moonlight. For a moment, Elias closed his eyes and simply listened to the hum of insects, to the soft brush of wind, to the soundless rhythm of stillness itself. He thought about how the sanctuary lived without striving, how peace here wasn't something built, but something remembered. It was the same kind of peace that existed in the pauses between waves, or in the hush after a candle was blown out. He opened his eyes again. The moon had climbed higher, its light now filtering through the willow's curtain of leaves. Each leaf glimmered, faintly trembling, as though whispering goodnight to the pond below. Elias smiled, feeling an echo of that tenderness within himself. When he stood to leave, he noticed a small feather resting on the dock, white, delicate, perfectly still. He picked it up, turning it in the light. It caught the glow of the lantern and seemed almost to pulse with life. He tucked it gently into his sleeve pocket, a simple keepsake of the night. The path back to the caretaker's quarters felt softer underfoot now. The lanterns burned evenly, their golden halos unbroken. The willow's silhouette leaned gracefully over the pond, and the world seemed to breathe as one vast, quiet exhale. Elias slid open the paper door and stepped back inside. The tea had cooled slightly, but its scent still lingered in the air. He placed the empty cup by the window and extinguished the incense. A thread of smoke drifted upward, twisting into the starlit air. The sanctuary had fallen completely still. He could sense it, a hush so complete that even his heartbeat felt absorbed into it. He sat once more on the mat, legs folded beneath him, hands resting loosely in his lap. The feather lay beside him on the table, its edges glowing faintly in the lamplight. He looked toward the window, where the reflection of the willow swayed gently. Outside, the moonlight pooled across the pond like silver silk. Elias breathed in slow and steady. The night answered with silence, vast, tender, and whole. The night had deepened into its quietest hour. The sanctuary rested beneath a sky strewn with distant stars. Their faint light mirrored perfectly in the still pond below. The willow stood sentinel beside the water, its long branches swaying in a rhythm as slow and soft as breath. The lanterns burned lower now, their flames small but unwavering, surrounded by a faint halo of warmth against the cool air. Inside his quarters, Elias rose once more. He had not slept yet, not out of restlessness, but because the night itself invited wakefulness of a different kind, one steeped in reflection rather than motion. He slipped on his robe of pale linen, its threads worn smooth with time, and stepped out into the open. The wooden boards of the veranda felt cool beneath his feet, carrying the faint scent of cedar and dew. He paused, listening. The soundscape of the night was a symphony of gentleness. Frogs murmuring from the shallows, the faint tinkling of chimes swayed by invisible breezes, and somewhere far off, the whisper of flowing water from a small stream that fed the pond. Every sound came and went without hurry, leaving silence richer for its brief presence. Elias made his way toward the willow. In his hand, he carried a small wooden bowl. Inside it were the remnants of dried flower petals and fine sand offerings that he often scattered into the pond as a quiet act of gratitude. He knelt at the water's edge, the reflection of the moon bright against his face. The willow's leaves brushed his shoulder lightly as if in greeting. He tipped the bowl and let the contents drift downward. The petals floated for a moment, pale pink-white and faintly lavender, before slowly dissolving into the water's surface. The sand sank in shimmering trails, catching the moonlight like a handful of stars, sinking gently into a sky turned upside down. For a long while, Elias simply watched the ripples expand. Each circle widened until it touched the edge of the pond and faded. He found a kind of teaching in that how even the smallest gesture could ripple outward into stillness, its trace remaining in ways unseen. He breathed deeply, taking in the mingled scent of wet earth and the faint sweetness of the petals. The air was cool, brushing against his skin like silk. When the ripples had vanished, Elias leaned back on his hands and looked toward the horizon. The sky had begun to pale slightly, not with dawn, but with the distant promise of it. A single cloud moved slowly, tinted with silver light. The sanctuary seemed to exist between breaths, caught in the space where night and morning touched but had not yet parted. Bakwa. He rose, brushing moss from his robe, and walked along the pond's curve toward a small pavilion tucked between reeds. It was a place rarely used by guests, open on all sides, built for meditation and quiet watching. Inside, a round cushion sat on the floor beside a small shelf holding a single clay bowl filled with polished stones. Elias sat upon the cushion and gazed outward. The pond's reflection shimmered like glass, disturbed only by the faint movement of a koi gliding near the surface. Its body glowed pale gold beneath the moonlight scales, shifting with soft iridescence. It circled slowly, then vanished beneath the willow's shadow. He closed his eyes. The night pressed gently around him, cool air against his skin, faint scent of moss, the texture of woven fabric beneath his hands. His breath matched the rhythm of the pond, a rise, a fall, a pause. A single drop of water fell from the willow's branch above, landing somewhere close. The sound was delicate, barely there, yet it rippled through him as though reminding him of time's gentle passage. Elias thought of how everything in the sanctuary lived by quiet cycles. The willow shed its leaves and grew them anew. The pond reflected light and gathered darkness in equal measure. Even the lanterns each night were lit and later extinguished so their light could rest too. There was a wisdom in that, a rhythm softer than thought, but stronger than will. He let the thought drift away, replaced by stillness. In the stillness came peace, and within peace, something almost like listening, not to the world, but to what the world left unspoken.
Gigakiti.
When Elias opened his eyes again, the stars had shifted slightly. He felt no urgency to move. Instead, he reached for the small clay bowl of stones beside him. They were smooth from years of touch, each one holding the memory of countless evenings just like this. He lifted one and turned it over in his palm. It was warm from the night air, its texture fine and comforting. He placed the stone gently back into the bowl, hearing the soft click it made against the others. The sound was modest, but it carried weight, the kind of sound that ended a thought without words. He rose slowly and stepped outside the pavilion. The air felt different now, cooler and more fragrant. A light mist had begun to gather over the pond, softening every edge. The willow, the lanterns, the distant cottages, until the whole world seemed wrapped in veil-like silver. Elias watched as the mist curled between the reeds, forming gentle shapes that drifted then vanished. He remembered something an old gardener once told him long before he came to the sanctuary, that mist was the earth's way of dreaming aloud. It rose when the ground breathed, when night grew so still that thoughts themselves could be seen. He smiled faintly at the memory. It felt true here in this place of quiet. The pond's whisper, the willow's motion, even the lantern's glow, all seemed to belong to a single vast dream.
Hagurt.
Elias returned along the path, passing beneath the willow's canopy once more. The leaves brushed against his robe, releasing a faint sound like rainfall on paper. He could feel their moisture where they touched his skin. At the pond's edge, he paused and looked down. The moon's reflection trembled slightly as a breeze passed. In its mirrored light, he saw himself small, indistinct, but at peace. Around that reflection, the willow's silhouette curved protectively, framing him in gentle arcs. He whispered a simple word of thanks, not to anyone in particular, but to the night itself. The lanterns flickered faintly, as if in response, their glow deepening to honey gold. The sound of the chimes drifted again, softer now, carried from somewhere near the veranda. Elias made his way back toward his quarters. He slid the door open and stepped inside, leaving his sandals neatly at the threshold. The faint mist followed him, curling just past the frame before dissolving. He set the wooden bowl on the table beside the feather he'd found earlier. The two objects, one from water, one from air, seemed to belong together. A quiet harmony of elements. He extinguished the final lantern within his room. Only moonlight remained silver and soft, tracing the edges of the walls. Outside the willow, swayed once more, its leaves whispering secrets that only the night would ever know. Elias lay down upon his mat, feeling the cool fabric beneath his hands. His eyes closed slowly. The hum of the pond, the hush of the breeze, and the faint echo of chimes lulled him toward rest. The sanctuary breathed with him in out a single rhythm shared. The faintest hint of dawn brushed the edges of the horizon, soft and pearly. It arrived not in light, but in tone, a quiet cooling of night sounds, a gentler movement of the air, a feeling that the world had turned a slow and secret page. The Willow Tree Sanctuary slept beneath a thin veil of mist, and the pond reflected nothing but a dreamlike haze. The lanterns still glowed faintly, their flames reduced to tiny embers that wavered with the coming morning. Elias stirred before sunrise as he always did. He woke not from need, but from the sanctuary's own rhythm, as if the place itself invited him gently back into motion. He sat up slowly, letting the stillness settle around him like a soft robe. The room smelled faintly of cedar and cool air touched with a trace of last night's tea. He rose, folded his bedding neatly, and opened the paper screens to the veranda. Mist flowed inward like pale silk, curling around the wooden posts. Beyond the veranda, the willow appeared as a tall shadow, its form softened by dew. The sound of the pond was different now, quieter still, yet deeper somehow, a slow inhalation beneath the world's surface. Elias stepped out, his bare feet dampened by the thin layer of moisture on the boards. The air was cool enough to feel alive against his skin, yet gentle, a waking breath. He walked down to the edge of the pond where the mist lay thickest. The water surface seemed to hold the light of dawn before the sky did, gathering it like a secret. Elias knelt, cupped his hands, and lifted a small pool of that liquid silver. It trickled through his fingers, cool and pure, returning to itself. He watched the ripples move outward, widening into quiet rings that faded into stillness. Above him, a bird called softly, one single note, clear and fragile, marking the first sound of morning.
So,
Returning to the veranda, Elias prepared the tea for dawn. This was always a slow and cherished ritual. Water leaves, heat, and time woven together until aroma and warmth filled the air. Today, he chose a blend of jasmine and barley, earthy and sweet. He measured it carefully, the grains and petals falling with faint rustles into the small clay teapot. As the kettle began to warm, a soft hiss rose, echoing like distant wind. The steam's scent wound through the room, mingling with the morning air. Elias arranged 2 cups this time, though he expected no company. It was an old habit, a quiet honoring of the unseen, perhaps the spirits of the place, or simply the presence of peace itself. When the tea was ready, he poured it slowly, watching the pale amber liquid swirl and settle. He carried one cup to the veranda's railing and placed it there, letting the rising mist gather around it. Then he took the other in his hands and sipped. The taste was round and mellow, a memory of earth and sunlight softened by jasmine's gentle sweetness. The warmth spread through his chest like a quiet sunrise. He leaned against the post, watching as the mist began to lift. Shapes emerged softly. The pond first, then the willow, then the curved path lined with lanterns, now dimmed and ready for rest. The sanctuary seemed to exhale as though night itself had finally released its last long sigh. In the gentle clearing light, Elias began his morning tending. He moved first toward the garden that bordered the sanctuary, where moss grew thick and ferns curved in elegant spirals. He carried a small bamboo rake and used it to trace patterns in the sand around smooth stones. The act was not about design, but about rhythm circles within circles, each motion reflecting his breath. The sound of the rake brushing through the sand was soft and deliberate. The mist continued to drift through the garden, wrapping the stones in a faint shimmer. Dewdrops clung to the fern tips, trembling with every small vibration of air. When he finished, Elias knelt and brushed a fallen petal from one of the stones. Beneath it, a tiny snail had begun its slow path. Its shell glistened with dew, carrying an entire reflection of the sky within it. Elias watched it move, feeling a kinship with its patience. Everything here knew how to take its time. He returned the petal beside it, a small act of symmetry, and rose once more. By now, the mist had begun to thin enough that the outlines of distant trees were visible, the bamboo grove beyond the pond, the curved gate at the path's end, the far hills still hidden in shadow. The light filtering through the willow had turned the air green and gold, each leaf holding a droplet that caught the dawn. Elias walked beneath the tree and placed his palm against its trunk. The bark was cool, textured like woven cloth. He could feel a faint vibration beneath it, not sound, but life itself, slow and steady as the pond's breath. "Good morning," he murmured, his voice scarcely above the hush of leaves. He stood there for a long while, his hand resting on the willow's side. In that stillness, he thought about how the tree had witnessed every night and morning since the sanctuary's founding, how it never resisted time but swayed with it. Its strength was in yielding its grace in constancy. From nearby, the sound of water trickled softly, the small stream feeding the pond. Elias followed it with his eyes and noticed how its path shimmered through the stones, catching sunlight like tiny threads of glass. He crouched beside it, letting his fingers trail in the flow. The current felt cool, purposeful, endlessly renewing. He realized as he watched it that this was what peace meant. Not stillness without motion, but movement without disturbance. He gathered a few sprigs of mint from the garden and returned to the veranda. The mist had almost fully lifted now, and the first golden rays touched the tops of the lanterns. A small group of sparrows fluttered down to the edge of the pond, their reflections rippling with each delicate step. Elias smiled, breaking one of the mint leaves between his fingers. Its fragrance released instantly, fresh green, a touch of morning itself. He placed the leaves into the teapot for a second infusion, watching them dance in the light. He sat down with his tea and the small feather from the night before, which he now set on the table beside him. The feather caught the dawn like a prism, its edge faintly iridescent. He found himself wondering which bird had left it, perhaps one of the doves that sometimes nested in the eaves, or a passing heron from the nearby marshes. The thought faded as easily as it came, replaced by the warmth of the cup in his hands. The sanctuary's silence was no longer the silence of night, but of gentle awakening, a different kind of quiet, full of beginnings instead of endings. The willow stirred once more, its branches brushing the surface of the pond. The ripples spread outward, mingling with the reflections of the lanterns and the morning sky. Elias closed his eyes and listened to the whisper of water, the faint rustle of leaves, the heartbeat of the place itself. He felt both small and infinite, as if he was simply another element of the sanctuary's endless rhythm. The mist was gone now, replaced by clear air that glowed with pale gold. Morning had arrived without fanfare, carrying calm instead of brightness. And as the first warmth of sunlight reached his face, Elias smiled content, unhurried and utterly at home in the quiet unfolding of the new day. The sun had climbed gently into the sky. But even in daylight, the Willow Tree Sanctuary kept its hush. The air shimmered faintly with warmth, carrying the mingled scents of moss tea leaves and cedar wood. The pond, once wrapped in mist, now shone with soft clarity, its surface touched by golden light that rippled across the water like threads of silk. Elias moved through the garden paths with a wicker basket on his arm. It was time for the mid-morning tending, a quiet rhythm he'd followed for years. He gathered blossoms that had opened overnight and trimmed those that had begun to fade, whispering a kind word to each stem. The garden seemed to breathe with him. Every petal and blade leaned toward the still air as though listening. The willow's branches swayed above, filtering sunlight into shifting patterns across the path. Small shadows of leaves drifted across Elias's robe as he knelt by a patch of blue wildflowers growing between the stepping stones. He touched their soft petals, their color deep and serene. Each detail, the warmth of sunlight, the hum of bees, the faint crunch of gravel wove together into a tapestry of calm. He filled his basket with petals and herbs, lavender, chamomile, mint, and a handful of jasmine buds that would soon unfurl. Each plant carried its own note of fragrance, its own memory of soil and sun. When he reached the far end of the garden, he paused beside a shallow stone basin filled with clear water. It reflected the sky in miniature, a patch of soft blue surrounded by moss and ferns. Elias dipped his fingers into it, feeling the coolness slide over his skin. He poured a little from his bamboo ladle, letting the water fall over the stones, its sound a whisper too gentle to disturb the morning air. This place he thought was a map of time itself, every leaf and ripple tracing a patient rhythm. He could feel it in the air, in the slow turning of light upon water. Nothing hurried here. Everything simply became. Elias sat for a while on a low wooden bench, setting the basket beside him. A dragonfly hovered near the basin, its wings catching the light in flashes of emerald and silver. It paused for an instant, suspended between water and sky before darting away. He followed its flight with his eyes until it vanished into the willow's shade. He poured himself a small cup of barley tea from the thermos. He had brought the liquid still warm from the kettle. Its nutty scent mingled with the sweetness of the flowers nearby. Sipping slowly, Elias felt the quiet within him deepen, not as absence, but as fullness.
And Matthew?
After some time, he rose and began arranging the collected flowers in small ceramic bowls to place throughout the sanctuary. One for the veranda, one for the guest house door, another for the path by the willow. It was a ritual not for beauty alone, but for harmony, to remind the place of its own living balance. He carried the first bowl toward the main hall, where the paper screens glowed faintly from the filtered light within. Inside, the scent of cedar mingled with cool air from the open doorways. He placed the bowl at the center of the low table, arranging each petal as though composing a small poem. As he worked, a soft breeze drifted through, stirring the paper screens just enough to make them sigh. The faint rustle echoed through the room like pages turning. Elias looked up and watched the movement, feeling a quiet joy rise in his chest. A joy not of doing, but of being among. He thought for a moment of the many travelers who had passed through this place. Some stayed for a night, some for weeks. Each left something unseen behind, a trace of breath, a fragment of thought, a small echo of rest. The sanctuary absorbed it all, the invisible stories of those who came seeking peace and found it reflected in the still water. Elias stepped back outside. The air was beginning to warm, carrying a golden haze that shimmered above the path. Cicadas had begun their steady song from the distant trees, a gentle rhythmic pulse that blended with the soft gurgle of the pond's feeder stream. He crossed the small wooden bridge that arched over that stream and paused midway. Below him, the current moved, lazily curling around smooth stones and drifting reeds. A few fallen willow leaves floated past small green boats carried toward the pond. He leaned against the railing, following them with his eyes, until they disappeared into the larger water, joining its endless reflection. From the far side of the bridge, the sanctuary's bell hung beneath the eaves, small bronze shaped like a lotus. A slender cord dangled from it, tied with a faded blue ribbon. Elias gave it a soft pull. The bell chimed once its tone clear and resonant. It lingered in the air, then melted into silence so smoothly that the quiet that followed seemed more complete for it. He smiled. That was the essence of the place, sound and silence holding hands. Aki returning toward the willow, Elias placed the last of the flower bowls along the pond's edge. The water's surface caught their reflection, multiplying color and light. The scent of the blossoms drifted outward, joining the natural perfume of the morning. He knelt and watched small ripples form where the petals touched the water. Each movement was minute but meaningful, a language without words. For a time he sat there motionless, the basket now empty beside him. The warmth of the sun lay soft upon his shoulders. Bees moved lazily from flower to flower, their wings glinting like threads of glass. The air shimmered with life, yet everything remained peaceful, as though the world had learned to move quietly enough not to wake itself. He reached into the sleeve pocket of his robe and took out the white feather. Turning it in his fingers, he held it up to the light. It glowed faintly, as if remembering the moon. He placed it gently beside the bowl of flowers, letting a breeze lift it slightly before it settled again. From somewhere beyond the sanctuary walls came the sound of bamboo rustling the grove at the far edge, where wind spoke in its softest tones. Elias knew that soon he would walk there as he did every afternoon, to collect fallen bamboo leaves and check the pathways. But for now, he simply sat and watched the willow's reflection dance upon the pond. The ripples shimmered like silk, then disappeared. The air was fragrant with the mingling of tea water and sunlight. In that moment, The sanctuary felt perfectly balanced, every element in harmony, every breath in its right place. Elias closed his eyes, listening to the quiet conversation between stillness and sound, between now and forever. The garden held him like a slow exhale, and time itself seemed to rest beside him. Afternoon drifted softly across the Willow Tree Sanctuary. The light had deepened to a golden hue, touching the pond with a quiet shimmer and filling the air with the warmth of late day. The wind was barely perceptible, only enough to sway the willow's branches in slow arcs, their tips brushing the water like the strokes of a calligrapher's brush. Elias had finished his morning tasks and now prepared for his gentle walk to the bamboo grove at the sanctuary's edge. He gathered a small cloth pouch, a folded fan, and a slender rake. There was no hurry. The grove waited as it always did, calm, steady, unchanging in its patience. As he stepped onto the curved bridge, the world seemed to slow further. Beneath him, the water reflected clouds, drifting like pale silk ribbons. The pond smelled faintly of moss and sunlight, a scent that deepened with warmth. A dragonfly hovered above the surface, its body flickering in and out of shadow. When Elias reached the far bank, the sound of bamboo leaves greeted him, a sound like whispers, layered upon whispers. The grove rose before him, tall and luminous, its green stems gleaming softly where sunlight filtered through. Each stalk bent slightly, never breaking, and their collective rustle formed a quiet rhythm that matched the beating of the heart. He paused at the entrance, closing his eyes for a moment to listen. It was a sound that existed between breath and silence, the language of stillness in motion. Now, the path into the grove was narrow, carpeted with fallen leaves that gave softly beneath his feet. The air was cooler here, carrying the faint sweetness of fresh bamboo and damp soil. As Elias walked deeper, the light dimmed to a gentle jade shade. Sunbeams filtered through the tall stalks in slender shafts, catching in drifting dust motes that sparkled as they moved. He ran his fingers along the nearest stem, feeling the smooth coolness of its surface. The bamboo responded with the faintest vibration, a hollow hum that seemed to travel upward, joining the sigh of the grove itself. Each stalk held its own tone, and together they sang the softest of songs. At a small clearing, Elias stopped and unfolded his fan. The air within the grove was still, so his movement stirred it slightly, sending a wave through the leaves above. The resulting sound, the gentle brushing of thousands of thin blades, felt like rain without wetness, music without melody. He found a flat stone and sat setting his rake and pouch beside him. From the pouch, he took a piece of rice paper and a stick of charcoal. Sometimes, in the quietest hours, he sketched the forms around him, not to capture them exactly, but to understand their stillness. He drew slowly a curve of bamboo, a sweep of leaves, a faint impression of the breeze. The marks were simple and unhurried. Between strokes, he paused to listen to the murmuring of the grove, to his own breathing, to the unseen life within the soil beneath. A small sound reached him then, the faint tap of something light falling onto the ground. He looked down and saw a single bamboo leaf settling beside his knee. Its color was gold green, its edges curled slightly inward. He picked it up, holding it against the paper, as though the grove itself had offered him a mark to include. He placed it gently between the pages of a small notebook and continued drawing. When he finished, the sketch was little more than a suggestion, a few lines, a shadow, a breath. Yet it carried something essential, the quiet that words could not hold. The air grew warmer. Above, a few birds moved through the canopy, their wings creating ripples of sound that drifted downward. The scent of the bamboo deepened, fresh, faintly sweet, mingled with the earthy aroma of sunlit leaves. Elias leaned back against one of the stalks, the smooth surface cool against his robe. He thought about how the grove had always felt like another kind of sanctuary, one that required no tending, only presence. It asked nothing, gave everything. The way the stalks swayed in unison reminded him of breath, and he found his own breathing falling naturally into rhythm with them. After a time, he rose and began his small afternoon task, clearing the path of fallen leaves and checking for loose stones along the walkway. His rake moved gently, tracing arcs across the earth. The sound was steady and hushed, like brushstrokes over paper. Occasionally, a bamboo leaf would drift down from above, spinning in slow spirals before landing in the soft soil. He gathered a handful of these fallen leaves, tying them together with a thread of twine. They would dry in the sun near the veranda, later used for tea sachets or simple decorations. Even the smallest things, he believed, could hold peace if treated with care. At the grove's center stood a small stone basin filled with rainwater from earlier days. Elias approached and looked into it. The reflection showed fragments of sky and bamboo stems crossing like brushwork. He dipped his fingers into the basin, stirring the reflection, and watched as the shapes rearranged themselves, flowing into something new yet familiar. A light wind moved through, then stirring the grove with a soft rush. The sound surrounded him, filling the air like a long, slow breath drawn by the earth itself.
Priya.
When the wind settled, the grove fell into an even deeper calm. The only movement was the occasional shimmer of light across a leaf. Elias lingered there, his eyes half closed. He could feel the sanctuary beyond the grove, the willow by the pond, the small cottages, the bell by the bridge, all connected by invisible threads of quietness. He thought of how each place within the sanctuary had its own sound. The pond's gentle lap, the chime's soft ring, the whisper of willow leaves. And here, the bamboo spoke in tones of breath and patience. Together they formed a harmony beyond music, a conversation of peace. Elias gathered his pouch, folded the fan, and began walking back. As he neared the grove's edge, the sunlight grew warmer golden against the stems. A pair of doves fluttered past him, their wings brushing the air in soft rhythm. One feather drifted down, slowly circling before landing near his path. He bent to pick it up and smiled faintly. The second feather, a twin to the one resting by his teacup. He tucked it into his robe with the same gentle care as before. When he stepped back onto the bridge, the pond greeted him with reflected light. The willow swayed, welcoming him home from his quiet errand. The air smelled faintly of bamboo and sunlight. He stood there for a long moment, watching ripples shimmer across the water's surface until they faded into stillness. Back at the veranda, Elias laid the bundle of bamboo leaves to dry in the shade. Their soft green color glowed against the wood. The sanctuary seemed to hum faintly, with afternoon warmth, not loud, not visible, but alive in every beam, every ripple, every shadow. He poured himself a cup of cool water from the jug and sat by the window. The wind that had moved through the grove now touched the willow, setting its branches in motion. The sight brought him an unspoken sense of completeness, as though all of nature's gestures were one continuous movement. He breathed deeply, eyes half closed, and let the soft rustling fill him once more. The sound was endless, gentle, unbroken. In that quiet moment, the boundary between himself and the sanctuary seemed to dissolve completely, as if he too had become part of its eternal rhythm. The afternoon waned softly into evening, and the golden warmth of the day began to cool. The sanctuary glowed beneath a gentler light now, one that moved slowly across the pond and climbed the willow's boughs in streaks of rose and amber. Cicadas hummed their final songs, blending into the faint murmur of wind that slipped through reeds and lanterns. Elias stood by the veranda, hands resting loosely on the wooden railing. He could feel the shift that subtle, sacred moment when daylight exhaled and night drew its first deep breath. Twilight had always been his favorite hour, the in-between space where both worlds met without resistance. He turned toward the small tea pavilion beside the main hall, preparing for the evening ceremony. It was not an event for guests this night, but a ritual he performed alone, a practice of stillness more than of tea. The pavilion awaited in perfect readiness, a low table of cedar, 2 cushions placed opposite one another, and an open wall that faced the pond and the willow tree beyond. The air smelled of bamboo leaves drying in the shade of moss, warmed by sunlight and a faint smoke from distant incense. Elias began his preparations with unhurried grace. He set out the kettle, filled it with spring water drawn from the well near the grove, and placed it over the small charcoal burner. The faint crackle of flame rose, mingling with the sound of evening insects awakening in the garden. He arranged the utensils with care, the teapot, the scoop, the whisk, each motion deliberate and unbroken. His hands moved like water, steady and circular. He believed that peace lived not in stillness alone, but in the flow between one gesture and the next. When the kettle began to murmur, he lifted the lid and watched the first threads of steam rise. They curled upward, translucent and tender, carrying warmth into the cooling air. The scent of the spring water itself, clean, mineral quiet, filled the pavilion. From a small ceramic jar, he measured out the tea leaves, roasted barley and chrysanthemum, a blend for calm and clarity. The leaves fell into the pot with a soft rustle, like a whispering breeze over parchment. As he poured the first stream of water, the sound was steady and low. It filled the space between heartbeats. Asaso, outside, the first fireflies had begun to appear. Their slow, rhythmic glows hovered near the pond, floating above the water like small souls keeping time with the willow's motion. The lanterns along the path flickered to life as the light deepened, their golden reflections trembling gently. Elias poured the tea into 2 cups, as was his custom, placing one across from him on the empty cushion. He bowed his head slightly before beginning. The silence that followed was a silence full of listening. The world itself seemed to lean closer, the pond stilling, the branches swaying softer, the air thick with serenity. He lifted his cup, breathing in the aroma before tasting. The flavor was earthy smooth and faintly sweet, the chrysanthemum lending brightness to the roasted barley's calm. The warmth spread through his chest, settling like an inner lantern. He took a slow sip, then set the cup down and exhaled. Steam drifted upward, dissolving into the darkening air. Across from him, the other cup remained untouched, Yet the gesture of its offering made the space feel complete, as though the sanctuary itself was seated there sharing the moment. Dasida. A faint sound drew his attention, the soft splash of a koi breaking the pond's surface. Ripples shimmered outward, carrying reflections of lantern light across the water. The willow leaned slightly in response, its leaves brushing the pond's skin with a tender hiss. Elias watched it all unfold, as though time had forgotten to pass. The scene moved with its own rhythm, flame reflection, breath, ripple, and each motion returned naturally to stillness. He thought of all the evenings he had spent here, each one different, and yet the same. There was always the tea, the lanterns, the quiet, and the willow's patient dance. But each night also carried its own spirit, shaped by the air, the season, and the subtleties of thought that rose and faded without trace. In this one he sensed something especially deep, a quiet gratitude that had no object. It was not gratitude for anything but simply as itself, flowing through him like the tea's warmth. He closed his eyes for a moment, feeling it expand inside him. When he opened them again, twilight had deepened into early night. The sky above the pond glowed indigo, scattered with first stars. The reflection of the moon trembled faintly near the willow's base. Elias lifted the empty cup once more and rinsed it in the remaining water, his gestures precise and reverent. The tea ceremony was not merely about drinking, it was about returning each thing to harmony. The cups were dried, the pot cleansed, the whisk brushed free of leaves. Every act was its own small meditation. As he finished, he reached into his robe and drew out the two feathers, one from the pond, one from the grove. He placed them side by side on the table, their pale forms luminous against the wood. Then he added a single bamboo leaf from his bundle and a sprig of jasmine from the garden's morning gathering. The small arrangement was humble but radiant symbols of air, earth, and growth, all resting in perfect balance.
Ashima Shumata.
Elias sat for a long while, watching the arrangement in the lamplight. The shadows moved gently as the flame flickered, and he felt that if he were to listen closely enough, he might hear the faint hum of the world's own heartbeat. Outside, the fireflies drifted in slow patterns. Their lights pulsed softly, like distant lanterns guiding unseen travelers. The air had cooled, wrapping around him with the freshness of water and the sweetness of evening jasmine. The sanctuary breathed every reed, every leaf, every ripple moving together in one shared rhythm. Elias took one last sip of tea and placed the cup beside the feathers. "Thank you," he murmured to no one and to everything. He blew gently across the flame, and it bent once, twice before dimming into smoke. The darkness that followed was kind, the kind of dark that held warmth rather than absence. Outside, the willows swayed in silhouette, and the pond answered with a shimmer. The world was complete once more.
Bashir,
Night had gathered fully around the Willow Tree Sanctuary. The pond lay smooth and dark beneath the wide silver moon, and the willow stood as a guardian of dreams, its long branches tracing the air in quiet rhythm. Every lantern glowed faintly now, their golden light trembling over the water's surface, like breaths too soft to see. Elias moved slowly through the sanctuary's paths, carrying a small lamp. Its light spilled over moss and stone, forming little pools of warmth that vanished as he passed. He paused often, not out of weariness, but reverence. The night held a hush too complete to disturb. Above, the sky stretched vast and unclouded constellations, mirrored perfectly below. Between them, the sanctuary seemed to float neither of earth nor sky, but somewhere gently between. He reached the willow and set the lamp upon a flat rock. The flame flickered once before steadying. The branches whispered above their tips, brushing his shoulders like a blessing. Elias closed his eyes and listened to the sounds that filled the space around him. The slow chirping of crickets, the faint hum of water moving at the pond's edge, the sigh of air weaving through the leaves. Each sound was a thread, and together they wove the fabric of stillness. He knelt beside the pond, tracing his reflection with his gaze. The moon's image shivered softly across the ripples. So much light, he thought, and yet no noise at all. He dipped his fingers into the water, not to test it, but to touch the silence itself. The surface parted easily, cool and welcoming. Rings of silver spread outward, slow and even, until the pond became still again. Elias leaned back and breathed deeply. The air smelled of water and wood, with a faint hint of jasmine left from the garden. His thoughts drifted without aim, like petals on a current. He remembered the many evenings he had tended this place, each lamp lit, each path swept, each teacup rinsed and returned to its place. But memory felt soft here without weight. It passed through him gently, leaving peace instead of longing. A gentle hoot echoed from the far trees, the night owl beginning its watch. Its call was calm, steady, timeless. Elias smiled faintly, feeling the sound travel through the night like a single note played across still air. He rose and began his final rounds, walking slowly along the curved wooden paths. His lamp brushed the edges of the garden in pools of honey-colored light. Everywhere, He passed the sanctuary, seemed to breathe, doors slightly open to the night screens, glowing faintly, the sound of the wind moving through the corridors like a sigh. At the garden's edge, he paused beside the stone basin he had filled that morning. The water within was perfectly clear now, holding the moon's reflection like a single pearl. He dipped the ladle and let one thin stream fall back into the bowl. The sound was so delicate that it seemed almost imagined, yet it lingered in the air, joining the gentle hum of the pond. He whispered softly, "Everything returns as the ripples spread and disappeared." The truth of that felt neither sad nor sweet, only natural. Light returned to darkness, sound to silence, movement to stillness. Even the smallest acts, a cup lifted, a leaf brushed aside, were part of that quiet rhythm of return. Elias bowed slightly before the basin, then continued on. The night deepened. Crickets quieted. The lanterns grew dimmer, their glow softening at the edges. From the direction of the bamboo grove came the faintest rustle, a single wave moving through the tall stalks, like a breath released in sleep. Elias reached his quarters and slid the door open. The room was touched only by moonlight, pale and tender. On the table lay the small arrangement he had made earlier: 2 feathers, a bamboo leaf, and a sprig of jasmine. They caught the light like fragments of a quiet story. He set his lamp beside them and extinguished its flame. A wisp of smoke rose, curling upward until it vanished into the night. The scent of cooled oil lingered in the air. He sat cross-legged before the open screen, gazing out at the pond and willow. The sanctuary stretched before him like a single living breath. The ripples on the water moved faintly, slow as time itself. As he watched, he felt something within him shift, not a thought, but an understanding too simple to name. The sanctuary did not belong to him, nor he to it. They were merely 2 parts of the same stillness, keeping each other company through the endless cycle of dusk and dawn. The willow swayed once, its branches brushing the water with the softest sigh. The sound filled the air like a lullaby without words. Elias let his eyes close and breathed with it, slow and deep. Somewhere far away, a breeze drifted through the bamboo grove, carrying the faint fragrance of earth and rain. The scent reached the veranda, delicate and grounding, wrapping around him like memory made of air. The world was perfectly balanced. He lay down on his mat, the thin fabric cool beneath his hands. The night lightened within his mind, softening the last edges of wakefulness. His breathing slowed until it matched the rhythm of the pond, in out stillness between. Outside, the lanterns finally dimmed one by one. until only the moon remained watching in silence. The willow's shadow stretched long across the water, and the sanctuary fell into complete rest. Somewhere in the distance, the first breath of dawn waited, but not yet. Not for a long while. For now, the world belonged to the soft hum of night, to the willow's whisper, to the still heart of peace that asked nothing but to be. Elias drifted into sleep as the willow kept its silent vigil over the sanctuary. The pond held the moon gently in its hands, and every living thing breathed as one.